This is Join Us in France, episode 84. Hello, I'm Annie, and Join Us in France is an independent travel podcast about all things French, but mostly travel, except for today. Today I'm going to talk to you about a prominent French personality, and his name is Voltaire. I'm sure you've heard of him. The reason why I'm doing this is because originally Elise and I were planning to record an episode together, and then she had to bow out because of work reasons, which I understand, it happens. And so, just so that I could have an episode ready for you this week, I decided, well, why don't I share with the Join Us in France listeners this wonderful story I heard from a French historian called Valérie André. She has written many books, but I didn't see one on Voltaire, but she was on French radio talking about him, and she just lit my fire. It was really fun to listen to her, and so I listened again, and I took some notes, and I went and read some more, and I thought he was, I just had a lot of fun with this, so I thought, well, I could probably talk about Voltaire for a little bit. It's not going to be a very long show, I don't think, but I can tell you a few things about Voltaire that will make it fun for you when you visit France. For instance, when you go to the Pantheon, that was episode 71. Well, the first thing you see as you enter the crypt is Voltaire. And he has a beautiful mausoleum. It's kind of a little creepy in the way it's lit and all that. Anyway, it's very fun. And then there's Ciré, of course, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So, how about this Voltaire that you've heard of your whole life, but you probably don't know that much about him unless you've studied his writings. I have to say that, as you probably know, when French people do the baccalaureate, the first exam they have to take is a French exam. It's French literature exam. And mine happened to be on Voltaire, and that's because the jury, that's who they wanted me to talk about. And the text I was supposed to analyze was the last bit of Candide, the closing of Candide, which is a fabulous piece. It's unlike anything I had read at the time. Very fun, very profound at the same time. So one of my favorite pieces of literature anyway. All right. Voltaire died on May 30th, 1778 in Paris at age 83. He was at the height of his popularity with most people, but the Catholic Church denied him a proper burial because they didn't like him much for reasons that you'll see in a moment. By then, he had produced work of every genre: plays, poems, essays, satire, novels, history, scientific observation, and scientific publications. He was prolific, with more than 20,000 letters as well as 2,000 books and pamphlets that are credited to him. He provoked ire of people in high places, and he got in serious trouble, but he had a strong back. And of course, it helped that he was always financially secure because he was very good with money, and we'll talk about that as well in a few moments. He was super popular with the people. So 3 years after his death, so after the French Revolution as well, his body is moved to the Pantheon, where his epitaph reads, I'll say it in French and then in English. Let's see if you can understand the French first. Il combattit les athées et les fanatiques. Il inspira la tolérance. Il réclama les droits de l'homme contre la servitude de la féodalité. Poète, historien, philosophe, il agrandit l'esprit humain et lui apprit à être libre. So, he fought both atheists and fanatics. He inspired tolerance. He asked for human rights against the servitude of the feudal system. He was a poet, historian, philosopher. He broadened the human mind and taught us how to be free. Voltaire did not start out as popular or accepted. So how did he get to that point? That's what we'll talk about on today's show. The road he's traveled was unlikely and unusual, and as a result, he remains one of France's heroes. I mean, honestly, everybody's heard of Voltaire, even people who've never really studied any philosophy, any literature, or read any of his books. He's just in the consciousness of the people. He was born François-Marie Arouet in Paris on November 21st, 1694. He was born to a bourgeois family without any ties to nobility, and he didn't get along that great with his father for the most part, and I'll give you an example of why in a second. Now, let's get the name thing out of the way. His name, like I said a minute ago, is François-Marie Arouet, which is a perfectly normal French name, but it's a bit of a mouthful. He changed it to Voltaire in 1718 at age 24. And there are lots of stories about why he picked that name, but none of them are all that convincing, so I'm not going to spend any time going into that. What we do know is that the first work he published under the name Voltaire is a play called Oedipus. So, if you don't mind, I'll switch to calling him Voltaire right now. And as a little cultural note, side note here, the name Marie, is in France. It can still be, but it's unusual anymore. But it used to be used as a female or male name. So you would have names like François-Marie, which very few people have heard. But also, the one that most people have heard is Jean-Marie, which is always a man. And you see that name all over. It's unusual nowadays for French people to give compound names to their children. It can still happen, but it's the minority. It was super popular when I was born 50 years ago. So much so that my brother, my sister, and I, all three have compound names. You know, my mother, that was just what you did. It was a sign of wanting to be in the middle class. So that has changed quite a bit in the meantime, but in his days, I'm sure he was not the only François-Marie in his school. And speaking of school, Voltaire went to a school in Paris, in the Latin Quarter, the 5th arrondissement. It's called Louis le Grand. It was a Catholic Jesuit school at the time. And today it's still there, but it's a public high school now, and that means no tuition. Public school in France is the one that you don't pay for. The others are called private schools, just like in the US, really. It's just in England where they kind of turned that around a little bit. This school, Louis le Grand, was established in 1563, and it really looks like a great school even today. And no, you cannot visit it as a tourist. I checked. I would like to go in. I saw some pictures. It looked fabulous. This is the school that both Molière and Voltaire attended. It has an illustrious past with lots of famous people going there. I won't name them all, but I mean, you can, on various websites, you can see all the names. It's impressive. What matters is that Voltaire went to a great school despite his modest background. And it may seem contradictory that he studied at a Jesuit school, but at the time, Jesuits pretty much had the monopoly on higher education in France. So that was that or nothing. So he got that. That's how it works. At age 17, so in 1711, Voltaire decided that he didn't want to be a lawyer. That's what his father wanted. He wanted to be an author instead. So he's going against his father's wishes, but just to cover his tracks, he signed up for law school anyway. And the other thing he did that his father would not have approved of, and we know for a fact that he did not, is that he joined a thing called La Société du Temple. It was a literary and philosophical society that ran, end of 17th, beginning of 18th, where free thinking and libertine ideals were shared. At the time, the word libertine mostly meant free thinking, but it probably also included, other things that the word libertine means today. So, open-minded people, let's put it that way. This was a group of people who wanted to shake up society and rebel against both power and religion and try and get some progress going. Now, Voltaire's mother was very much in agreement with these views. In contrast, her father was very conservative. He espoused a more Jansenist, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to say that in English. Jansenist? Well, maybe. So he espoused a more Jansenist view of the world, which emphasized original sin, depravity. He insisted on the need for grace and predestination. I'm sure he was a barrel of laughs, that man. So Voltaire, he really liked to hang out with the cool kids and people who had progressive views. And he was also very willing to shock people just to make them laugh or to make them think. And so he got noticed quickly. Remember, he's only 17 when he joins this group. So, young kid coming up here with a lot of ideas. Now, I mentioned a second ago that Voltaire got into trouble at times. Well, on September 1st, 1715, Louis XIV died. And that was just a little over 300 years ago at the time of this recording, because it's September 2015 now, so this was September 1715, so 300 years ago. And because Louis XIV did not have an adult heir, the power went to a regent, Philippe d'Orléans. And that's when things started to sour for Voltaire. The Duc d'Orléans was not the person who was supposed to become the regent, and so there were a lot of political shenanigans going on. Voltaire was a friend of the opposing faction, and he wrote pamphlets to support them. And he had also accused the regent of having an incestuous affair with his daughter. I don't know if it was true or not. He could have made it up, or maybe not. He liked to shock people. So, and it's also possible, actually, that somebody else wrote those things and signed it Voltaire, because back then people did that. It doesn't really matter. Voltaire gets thrown in the Bastille in 1717 at age 23, and he's in there for 11 months. While in prison, he writes his first play, Oedipus, and that's how I see that he's very productive. He wastes no time. He's locked up in jail. Well, he's going to be writing because he can't do anything else. So, and that's how he got so much done in his life. It's just he took every minute to write and write and write and write. Voltaire gets out of the Bastille in April 1718, and he goes about his life, writing plays and making money. He doesn't get into too much trouble until 1725, and now he's 31. That's when he offends a young nobleman from a family called Rohan. They're at the theater. Voltaire says something to the young nobleman that kind of makes it clear he has nothing but disdain for him. Rohan wants vengeance, so he invites Voltaire to dinner, but instead of dinner, he gets him to be beaten up by his valets while he's sitting and snickers from his car. Well, it was a coach, but now Voltaire was not very athletic. He's mad. He decides he wants vengeance now. Takes fencing lessons, and he wants to challenge Rohan to a duel. Now, Rohan's family hears of it, and they don't really want to take any chances with a duel because lots of people got killed in duels. Sometimes both of them died. And so they arrange for Voltaire's arrest. He is thrown into the Bastille again in 1726, but this time he manages to get released quickly, and in return for the promise that he'll leave Paris and go to England. So, Voltaire makes good on that promise, and he moves to England, where he will stay for 2 years. Now, those 2 years are hugely important for Voltaire. A lot of things changes for him during that time. First of all, he learns English, which most French intellectuals at the time, they knew nothing about English, and they didn't want to know anything about it. They were not interested. Voltaire is also introduced to the ideas of deism, which were not prevalent in France. And he starts working on one of his most famous works while in England. It was called Letters on the English, and in French it's called Lettres philosophiques. Now this is interesting because he actually published this book in English first, And then it was published in French. So that was really scandalous. It's like weird. So his English was good enough to publish a book. He must have been really, really good because he only spent 2 years there. So that's not that long to get fluent enough to write a book. Now, this whole episode with Rohan, the nobleman that got him beaten up, and the fact that he lived in England also turned Voltaire into a fervent defender of reforms that would allow one to express themselves without being thrown into the Bastille. He always had this desire for more freedom, but now he really has something to concentrate on and to, he has a goal, a specific goal. He wants to be able to say things without being thrown in jail. So he advocates for more freedom of thought and of speech. And in England, he is astounded by the level of freedom that he finds compared to what they had in France. So Voltaire starts to write in favor of structural changes in France. He wants to reform French society by going after the corrupt judicial system and by going after the idea of divine right monarchy. In the French tradition, God gives the king the right to rule as he pleases. And God also gives the Catholic Church access to all goodness. So, as long as the people believed in the divine right of the king and of the church, the people's job was just to supply work, money, to keep the king and priests happy. And Voltaire wanted regular people to see that they've been set up for exploitation. Now, the judicial system in France was also a huge mess. There were 350 different judicial customs that were ruling different parts of France. Regular people had no idea what law they were supposed to follow. The judges bought their appointments. One could be held in jail for months before appearing before a judge. There were no juries. Torture could be used to extract confessions. That was A-okay. And, cherry on the cake, the king or the magistrates could confiscate anything that belonged to someone who was found guilty. So, if you had money, maybe they found you guilty because they wanted your money. So, just like it happened with Voltaire, people could be threatened and forced to move away or pay bribes without any formal accusation or trial. I mean, imagine you live in that society. You've got some money that the judge wants to get their hands on, or maybe you have property that the judge wants. Well, so he's going to set up some sort of phony accusation, and you're going to have to pay up or be out of there. So I'm really, really glad that Voltaire tackled all of that, because that does not make for a happy society anywhere. Doesn't matter who's doing it. It's bad. Censorship was also out of control back then. You couldn't print anything without getting it approved by official censors. So any book published without censor authorization could be burned, and anybody who participated in putting together a book, like printers, for instance, could get thrown in jail. Voltaire didn't want to submit to censorship, so he found ways to publish without it. He got his books printed in Amsterdam or The Hague or Geneva. In order to not get arrested, he had to write under other names. And sometimes he also had to publish rebuttals to his own works to say, no, I didn't really write this thing. Look, this is what I really believe. And this is where Candide comes in. He wrote plays and novels about fantastical countries that worked like France in many surprising ways. But they were fantastical countries. This was not France he was talking about, you understand? Where you'd think you were reading about events going on right now in Paris, but no, it was all going on in El Dorado or some other made-up place. And another method that he used so effectively was that he never concluded what the hero should think or do or not think. He let the readers draw their own conclusions. So he set up this story where you see the hero going through life and things happen that you go, oh goodness. But Voltaire doesn't tell you what to think. Voltaire just tells you a story, right? So he was really genius that way. And the other thing that was really wacko back then is that you couldn't make money from books. Printers were kind of an interesting bunch. They'd print a book, but then they never paid royalties to the author. Voltaire did not make any money from his books. Where he made money was in investments. He had learned from two brothers called Paris, that was their name, and they taught him how to speculate where he could invest and all of that. And as a result, he had money in ships and contracts for supplying the French army. And, you know, he was a really good businessman. And he was a millionaire by the time he was 45. So that's one of the things that really made it possible for him to say whatever he thought, because he had money left and right. And so he could disappear, go on a trip, make himself scarce, It's not like he ran out of options at any time. He was always many steps ahead of the people who were after him. Now let's talk a little bit about this wonderful place, Cirey, Cirey. At age 40, Voltaire lives in Cirey with the Marquise du Châtelet, and she has a lot of influence on him. And under that influence, he turns more towards philosophy than literature, and he also does a lot of science with her. She was a brilliant woman herself. She was a mathematician, an author, and also a physicist. The two of them were very erudite when it comes to biblical text and even apocryphal text, and they engaged in conversations about the role of religion in life and all sorts of things. Now, just like I said a few minutes ago, at the time, France is a monarchy established upon divine right. Nothing is secular. Power and religion go absolutely hand in hand. But Voltaire was not an atheist. He was not quite a deist either. He was extremely critical of established religion and the power of the church, but he also made fun of atheists. He was against the clergy, but not against faith per se. So Voltaire's philosophy is based upon his tacit belief in a divine maker, although it's often difficult to know if he was kidding or not. For instance, he said something. Okay, again, I'll quote it in French first and then give it to you in English. This is from the Dialogues, 17th conversation. I don't know how they translate that in English. It's divided into, different dialogues. Anyway, he says, Je veux que mon procureur, mon tailleur, mes valets, ma femme même, croient en Dieu. Et je m'imagine que j'en serai moins volé et moins cocu. So, he said, I want my prosecutor, my tailor, my valets, and my wife to believe in God. Because I think that if they do, they will rob me less, and I won't be cockled as often. So, it's possible he was saying that with a straight face, but it's also possible it was just a joke, une boutade, a joke, right? So, Voltaire is also a complicated person. He was very smart, and like many smart people, he enjoyed it when other people noticed that he was smart. So even though he was against the powers that be, he was very flattered when they praised him. So at various times in his life, he sided with this king or that duke. So Voltaire isn't so much against royalty, but he wants enlightened royalty. He is totally in the pocket of Russian royalty, for instance. He's not been to Russia, but he buys into that idea that Russian royalty is enlightened royalty. Another author of the time, Diderot, who had actually visited Russia, didn't fall for it quite that much, and they often argued about whether or not that was bogus or not. Voltaire was a very popular character with the general public. Now, he didn't have mass media. There was no Twitter, no Facebook, no podcast, no nothing. But everybody had heard of him all the same. He didn't live in France for a lot of his life because he was always persona non grata and because he was rich and he could move about as felt more evasive. He wanted to remain, on the move. He did return to Paris at the end of his life on the 19th of February, 1778, but that was only 3 months before his death. And when he came back, he was acclaimed as a national hero. The French Academy invited him to give a speech. This is what happens when you have strong censorship in any country, I'm sure. Then if it's forbidden, it's more desirable. And so people wanted to read his stuff. If it's the kind of book that you would read in hiding and that you would pass around only to the trusted people. And if somebody gave me a book and said, here's this book, it's amazing, but don't let anybody know you're reading it because they might throw you in jail for it, I wouldn't put it on my nightstand and forget about it. I would read it right away. And that's how it worked. People had heard of him because there was such oppression, and the people were not idiots. They wanted the freedom too. He defended ideals that the people were in agreement with. And so he was very popular. One of the things that made him super popular is actually something that happened in Toulouse. Okay, this is the story of Jean Calas in Toulouse. Jean Calas was a merchant from my hometown of Toulouse who was accused of killing his own son because the son wanted to convert from Protestant to Catholic. This took place between 1761 and 1762. Voltaire sided with the father, so the accused murderer, because he was against all religious fanatics. And he didn't want to give too much power to the church. But really, Voltaire was not so much siding with the Protestants. He was just speaking out against the overwhelming power of the Catholic Church. And at the time, Protestants were barely tolerated in France, and there was a lot of repression against all faiths that were not Catholic. The Edit de Nantes. So this is a document that gave people the right to be a Protestant. It was signed a couple of kings ago under Henry IV, but the situation got much worse for religious freedom towards the end of the reign of Louis XIV, because Louis XIV actually revoked the law, even though it was supposed to be perpetual. And it's not until Louis XVI, right before the French Revolution, that the king signed a new edict in Versailles that Protestants were tolerated again. So upon the death of Marc-Antoine Calas, so this was the son, and the shocking and very violent execution of his accused father, Voltaire wrote a treatise on tolerance. The accused and the victim are both already dead. So you might think that nobody's going to care, but the opposite happens. Voltaire's point is not to preach atheism, but rather religious tolerance. His message is very much accepted within the public because French people very much want the freedom to believe that what they would like to without being persecuted by the powerful church. Voltaire cannot name the church, so instead he calls it l'infâme, the infamy. And by that he doesn't mean the Catholic faith per se, but rather the religious institution that blunts people's conscience and their sense of right and wrong. And he calls upon people to use their intelligence and their sense of right and wrong rather than their allegiance to the particular church that they belong to. This is human nature. People get super involved with religious ideals, and then it just blunts their conscience, and they forget what's right and what's wrong. They just want to be hyper-religious, and that's never a good thing, in my opinion. And that was Voltaire's opinion too, so he was much smarter than I am, so maybe I'll just claim that I'm right because he said so too. No, that would be a fallacy, wouldn't it? Oh well. Now, Voltaire was very much an optimist at that point in his life. He writes all sorts of things, and he's very hopeful about people's ability to use their conscience and their sense of right and wrong. But he will lose much of that optimism later on, after the terrible earthquake in Lisbon, which killed so many people and inspired him to write Candide. That's when he starts writing more questioning pieces, or why would a benevolent God allow such terrible things to happen to innocent people? He makes a turn in his thinking, where he continues to believe in human progress, but not so much in providence. So Voltaire, he continues to believe in God, but this God is much of a clockmaker. He sets it in motion and then forgets about it. And that's as much God as Voltaire wants by the end of his life. So now let me get to the touristy part of this episode. The one place where you can see a lot about Voltaire and the Marquise du Châtelet is Cirey. Cirey was her castle. It's in eastern France. It's a little bit, just a tad south of Paris. Well, it's between Paris and Nancy. If you draw a line between Paris, yeah, kind of. It's midway between Paris and Strasbourg as well. So it's a beautiful castle. And what happened there is that when Voltaire published the Lettres philosophiques, which was a critic of French institutions, he almost got thrown into he almost got thrown into prison yet again. And his friend, la Marquise du Châtelet, tells him, well, you could come hide here. She's 12 years younger than him. Her name is Émilie de Breteuil. She has a husband. She doesn't care for him very much, and she's very much in love with Voltaire. And Cirey becomes their love nest, I guess. And it happens that Voltaire loves the place too. He was very wealthy, like I mentioned a few times. And so he gets some work going to improve on the property, and they just have a wonderful time together. They engaged in scientific experiments. They write and publish. They are just, it's a very intense relationship. And you can go visit this beautiful castle. So if you're in the Strasbourg area, I think it would be definitely something I want to see next time I'm in that area. I haven't been yet, so I can't tell you my experience with it, but it's definitely on my list. And it's not one where you're going to have busloads of tourists. It's going to be pretty low-key most of the year, I think. One of the things she's well known for is that she's the one who translated Principia Mathematica that Isaac Newton wrote. She's the one who translated it into French. And for the longest time, I think it's been maybe until about 50 years ago or something like that, that's the French translation that you could read. It was very good. And she did such a good job because she was a mathematician herself. So she understood the subject very well. And then the sad thing is that she dies, she was 12 years younger than him, but she dies before he does. She dies in 1749, and he is crushed, and he moves away from Cirey at that point. But his whole life, he felt that this was paradise on earth, and that's probably the happiest years of his life, living with this fabulous and very intelligent woman. So if you go today, you can visit this castle. You can see the Marquise's bedroom, the dining room. You can see they had salons. They had a big library. They had beautiful kitchens from the 17th century, and those are always fun to see. And they even had a small theater that Voltaire put together for his plays. And it looks like a very fun place to visit. Now, not very far from Cirey, you can also see a place called La Boiserie, where the Général de Gaulle lived. You can see the memorial of Colombey-les-Deux-Églises, which is 16 kilometers away. It's a war memorial. There's the Abbey de Clairvaux, of course, which is 33 kilometers from Cirey. And actually, it's not called Cirey. It's called Cirey-sur-Blaise. That's the actual name of the town. I'll put it in the show notes so you can see. And you can also see the house that belonged to Denis Diderot, who wrote the first encyclopedia. And that's in Langres. That's a little further away. It's 81 kilometers from Cirey. But I think, see, if I could take a week and go sit myself in the center there. I'm not sure where the most central place is. I'd have to look at the map a little carefully. But I would be very happy to take a few days and go look around at all these marvelous places. And if you go in the summer when it's not wet, even better. And you could probably add some wineries along the way, I bet. Anyway. And so that brings us to the end of the show. And because I have been talking for 40 plus minutes already, even though I said it was going to be a short episode, the French tip of the week today is the word pipelette. Une pipelette, or un pipelet for the masculine version, is somebody who talks too much. A bit of a blabbermouth, which I don't think I've done that today, but it's a chatterbox and a blabbermouth all put into one. So that's pipelette. Tu es une vraie pipelette. There you go. All right, everybody. Thank you very much, and we'll talk to you next week, hopefully with Elise. I hope. Au revoir. This brings us to the end of another Join Us in France travel podcast. You can leave a comment on the website, follow us on Facebook, or look for @Paris Podcast on Twitter. I put lots of information on Facebook and Twitter that never makes it into the shows. And also, this is a subliminal message. Join the mailing list now, today. You can do that on joinusinfriends.com. Look for the green button. Et c'est tout pour aujourd'hui.